Okay. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to acknowledge my co-authors, David Figlio and Chris Karbovnik, as well as the support of the Florida Department of Education and the funders of this study that obviously made this work possible. So today I'm going to be talking about voucher programs, private school choice programs, and the effects that these programs have on students who remain behind in traditional public schools. These programs are increasingly popular in the United States, so 25 states, DC, Puerto Rico, now have some form of private school choice or school voucher, school scholarship programs that allow students to receive public funds for use for tuition in private schools. If we think about how these programs might affect students who stay behind in traditional public schools, there may be mixed effects on these students, right? Through a couple of different channels. One possibility is that public schools feel increased pressure to perform better, to provide a better educational product, to make sure that they don't lose students to the private school sector. So they might increase the level of education that they're providing for all types of different students. Another possibility is that students in traditional public schools might be impacted because of changes in the composition of the peers who are remaining in the public school sector, right? And you might think of this as being either positive or negative with respect to promoting student outcomes based on the qualities of the peers who depart and go into the private school sector. The third possible channel is that resources that are devoted to students in the public schools might change. So on the one hand, you might have the per pupil funding following the students into the private school sector, and this means fewer resources in the public schools for students who are remaining. On the other hand, there may also be some improvement in resources to the extent that having students move into the private sector might do things like create smaller class sizes. So it's a little bit ambiguous exactly what direction you would expect those effects to go. We don't have a huge amount of evidence on what happens as these programs grow in size. So most of the literature that's looked at the competitive effects of private school choice programs have looked at the introduction of these programs when public schools, for instance, might not be certain about whether these programs are going to have staying powers and maybe responding potentially less. You also might think that these channels might change as the programs mature. And so we think it's important to get a sense of how the program effects evolve as these programs expand. So we look and provide new evidence on this point, as well as looking at how different student subgroups respond to the increased competition from these private school choice programs. And importantly, most of the past work in this area has concentrated on test scores, and we're able to provide some evidence on behavioral outcomes, such as student suspensions and absence rates. So a quick preview of findings. We find that students who are in public schools that face greater degrees of competition have improved outcomes. And these are relatively small, but very consistently measured across a variety of different models, a variety of different ways of measuring school competition. If you think about a 10% expansion in the size of a private school choice pattern, that's associated with about a 0.3 to 0.7 standard deviation, percent of a standard deviation change in test scores. So again, relatively small, but if you think about that as a doubling of a program size, those programs, those effects become obviously a little bit larger. You also see similar improvements in behavioral outcomes. So students in areas with more competition as these programs expand tend to see lower levels of suspensions and absence rates. We also see differences in student subgroups in terms of these effects. So we find that program effects are more pronounced for students who are have lower incomes, lower maternal education, lower measures of socioeconomic disadvantage. And again, these findings are quite robust to different ways of measuring this question. So we're looking at this in the context of the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program. The program was announced in 2001, started accepting students in 2002 to 2003. So this has been running for over 15 years now. It's had a lot of years to kind of get its feet wet as a program, right? The program is means targeted. So initially it was targeted at students with family incomes below 185% of the federal poverty line, which is consistent with the school free and reduced price lunch measure and equates to about $45,000 for a family of 4 in yearly income. The program has expanded over time along a number of different dimensions, including that there are now sliding vouchers available for students up to 260% of the federal poverty line. And you can also see that there's been an increase in terms of a number of different measures of participation. So the one that we're kind of focusing on primarily here is that red line at the bottom. The first year that the program operated, it had about 15,000, 16,000 students participating, and that's grown substantially over time so that more than 100,000 students are currently participating in the program, which is about 4% of the K-12 public school population in the state of Florida. You also see, if you look at that orange line, that there are a growing number of schools participating. So in the first year, there's about 900, and that's doubled over time. And of course, that top number is the dollars associated with the program, the expenditures, and that's increased substantially as well. So across all of these different measures, this program has grown a lot over the years that we're looking at in this data here. We use a sample of public school students in Florida matched to birth records, which allows us to do some really nice things with heterogeneity checks. It allows us to get really rich measures of students' socioeconomic statuses. We look at grades 3 through 8 because one of the outcomes that we're interested in is test scores, and those are the grades at which those are most readily available. Again, we look at a number of different outcomes. In addition to the average level of math and reading scores, we look at both of those domains separately, and we look at these absence and suspension rates as well to get some sense of the behavioral outcomes for students as these programs expand. We also use a number of different measures of competition. And a couple of important things to note here. So first of all, the way that we measure competitive pressure is actually based on the pre-policy level of private school, the landscape of private schools that a public school is facing prior to the policy. And the reason that we want to do that is because we're concerned that if private schools are making strategic decisions about where to locate based on how they think the public school is going to be performing, that might bias our estimates. And so we're looking at the private school landscapes that exist that we expect are going to be made more salient by this voucher program as these options open up and become realistic choices for students who are currently in the public school sector. We look at these different measures of competition. One is the density of the public schools within a 5-mile radius, just a count of the private schools serving the same level, elementary school, middle school, et cetera, within a 5-mile radius. The second one looks at the distance to the nearest private school from the public school. The third looks at the diversity of denominational options within a 5-mile radius. The fourth looks at the number of churches in a 5-mile radius under the theory that those are bodies that could start new private school options, have the resources and space potentially to do that. The last kind of individual measure, it looks at the number of private school students served in a student's grade within that 5-mile radius. That's a lot of measures, and so to make it a little bit easier to present results, we boil all of those down into one index measure of competition that takes information from each of these different sub-measures of competition and puts them into one single index number. So I was telling Dan, you might have noticed I was one of the young researchers in the introduction. I wasn't aware of the no Greek, no equation rule, so I apologize for the equation up here, but I'm going to get to the slide that really focuses on the interpretation here. The things that we're doing here that are important to know are, first of all, that fixing the policy competition to the pre-policy level that I already talked about. Another one is another source of concern that we have are that students might be locating in areas strategically and that the performance of the schools that they're locating in might be correlated with competition. And so what we're doing is we're using within student measures to see whether compared to your own trajectory when the program is smaller, students see improvement over time. And in particular, the measure that's most important here is this expansion times competition measure. So the interpretation of what we're doing is looking at whether students, as the program expands compared to their own performance when the program is smaller, do better when they're in higher performing areas relative to how student gains in performance in lower competition areas. So we're taking a split for each measure, looking at high competition versus low competition schools and checking how students do as the program expands. So our main results here, I'm going to have you largely focus on this blue bar. This is our index measure that takes all of these measures of competition and boils them into one piece. What you can see is across the spectrum for all of these different measures, this is the math and reading combined measure. We see improvements for students who are in more competitive areas as the program expands relative to these students in lower competition areas. So regardless of which measure we use, we're consistently seeing small but measurable improvements for students as the program is expanding. Again, it's a little bit smaller for distance, for instance, compared to slots per grade, but it's a very consistent pattern. If we break this down by the math versus reading separately, you can really see that on the left here, or right, your right, we've got the reading outcome, and that's much more where we're seeing effects. So the math results are positive, but substantially smaller, suggesting that these improvements are largely coming through literacy and reading changes more so than math. So this looks at the behavioral outcomes. We have suspensions and absences. And in these cases, of course, declines in these measures is a good thing. And so again, we're seeing declines in both suspension rates and absence rates for students who are in higher competition areas disproportionately as these programs are expanding. So you can see that there are a few coefficients where if you can follow the bars, they're not all statistically significant, but the pattern is very consistent across these different types of measures and shows improvements in both cognitive and behavioral outcomes for students as these programs are expanding. Another way to think about the program expansion is that it's relatively steady over time. So instead of using the measure of program expansion that we have, which is a logged measure of the number of students who are participating, we can also just look at this as a progression over time as we know that this program is expanding on all of these different types of dimensions. And what you see is a fairly steady march up in these different outcomes over time. So the ones who are the outcomes that are positive are largely your cognitive outcomes that you want to be going up over time. And the green outcomes down there are the suspension and absence outcomes that you hope to be going down. These are in standardized terms, standardized effect size terms, and hundredths of a standard deviation. So they're all on the same scale, and you can see very similar patterns for all of these outcomes kind of in the directions that we hope that they should be going in. I'm a little bit low on time, so I'm going to skip to this version of the looking at heterogeneity. And what this does is we take all of these great birth measures that we have and we collapse them into one index measure of socioeconomic status. So we have measures at birth such as whether a birth was paid for by Medicaid, maternal education, age of birth, the median zip code, income, where children are born. And we use all these and we collapse them into one index that captures the socioeconomic status of students and separate that into deciles. What you can see is that the effects are largest for students who are in the lowest deciles of the socioeconomic status index. This is fairly sensible, right, as this is a means targeted program. And so it makes a lot of sense that the students who perhaps schools are particularly concentrating on maybe these lower income students. On the other hand, you see that the benefits really continue to persist even as students go into the upper deciles of the socioeconomic status. So the effects are more pronounced for low income students, but you continue to see benefits for higher income students as well. If I had shown you the other slides, the other sets of heterogeneity slides, you would also see that across most different breakdowns of groups that we're looking at, you see very consistent benefits to students across most of these outcomes. The patterns are generally in the direction that more competition is promoting better outcomes for students across a number of different subgroups, but is particularly pronounced for students in these lower SES groups. So to wrap up conclusions here, we think this is a really exciting study because it shows that as these programs scale up, there are these continued improvements for students who are in these higher competition areas. We see this consistently across both the behavioral and the SES, behavioral and the cognitive outcomes. And again, a very stable result in terms of similar results for different subgroups of students. In terms of policy considerations, we think this is a really important question because of the growth of these private school choice programs in the United States. We often think about these as programs primarily, of course, geared towards students who are making the choices, but measuring the effects on students who remain behind in public schools is really important as well. And there are often concerns that these programs might hurt students who are staying behind in public schools. Our results strongly suggest that that isn't necessarily that's not a terribly a concern that we see borne out in the data, right? We see that students are actually continuing to improve as these programs expand. We also see, again, that these are very consistent across the distribution. And so there may be some level of targeting, particularly at these students who are eligible for these vouchers, but the programs are more diffuse than that, which is a very positive result as well. We do see, if we compare these effects, that the introduction of programs tends to be, you have to have a large level of scale up to get the same bang for your buck as introducing a private school choice program in the first place. But again, the story overall is of continued improvement with these programs. Thank you.